Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Now for this week's video, I pre-recorded it last week while I was still in New Orleans for the WEFTech show. But just because it's been pre-recorded, we're still streaming it live Tuesday at 2 o'clock, which is the normal time, and we're still standing by live to answer your questions in the chat section. Now if, like a lot of folks, you're watching this on replay, we'd love to see your comments and your questions in the comment section, and we reply to those pretty darn quickly. All right, let's take a look at today's topic: using Gmail with the Horner OCS. Now for those machines that have the capability of sending emails, like those that are controlled with the Horner OCS, Gmail seems to be the dominant email client. But security requirements do change over time, and as we record this in October of 2022, we're going to let you know exactly what you need to know in order to use OCS with Gmail. All right, let's break down today's topic. We're going to start by taking a look at some example email applications, some areas where you can really take advantage of that capability in your machine. We're going to talk about Gmail security requirements for third-party apps. We're going to give you the step-by-step procedure for generating an app password, which seems to be the secret sauce that's going to allow Gmail to work. And then we're going to go through an example OCS email application so you can get some ideas on how you might be able to integrate email capability into your next OCS project. Let's talk about some different email applications. Let's start by using email to enunciate alarm conditions. So that can be really valuable. When an alarm condition occurs, you not only can provide notification on the screen that an operator can see, but you can use the email capability to enunciate that via electronic means as well. You can pre-configure text emails in Cscape with text describing a specific alarm and what needs to happen next. And you can do that in anticipation of when that alarm may actually occur. Now another bonus is you can actually embed live machine data in that email text. For instance, if you have an over temperature condition that you're looking to enunciate, not only can you put text in the email that says, hey, we've got an over temperature condition in the oven, but you can embed real-time temperature data so that when that is sent out, it might say, hey, the actual temperature right now is 703.5 degrees, which gives more information to those that are receiving the email. So that's pretty valuable. Now, what else can you use email capability for? Well, you can use it to deliver file attachments on demand or on a schedule. What are some examples of that? Well, some files that you might want to send from a machine to a person might be a data log of your process parameters. That might be something that certain personnel in the plant are interested in. Also, what about production reports? Send at the end of the shift, at the end of the day, maybe at the end of the week. Also, quality reports. Every time you do a changeover to a new part, you might want to send a quality report to the quality manager for the part that was previously run. How about batch data? Maybe you've got a process in which you are generating batches from time to time, and every time a batch is complete, you want to send a receipt type document via email to give all the details on the size of the batch and all the other information that's pertinent. So that's another example of using email. Let's talk about using email for preventative maintenance programs. Maybe you want to generate an email whenever a machine hits a certain milestone. Maybe that's a certain number of hours of operation. Maybe that's a certain number of machine cycles. When either of those conditions occurs, maybe you want to send an email that says, hey, the machine's been running for 1,000 hours. It's time to do some preventative maintenance. Or maybe it's not based on hours of operation, but in machine cycles. You get the idea. Also, it might not be based on hours or cycles. You also might want to generate an email whenever a particular parameter falls out of range. Maybe a vibration parameter that you're monitoring, maybe a temperature parameter that you're monitoring. If those fall out of range, you want to generate an email, again, that flags that some maintenance is required on that machine to get the most out of the machine. So as you can see, generating emails from an OCS when you're controlling a machine can offer some definitive advantages. Now let's talk about security requirements for Gmail. And again, for whatever reason, Gmail seems to be the dominant email client when it comes to machines sending emails, whether you're talking about a Horner OCS or you're talking about a traditional PLC that has that capability. And some of them do, not many, but some of them do. Now, something happened in May of 2022, and that is that Google stopped supporting the use of third-party apps that use only Google credentials to log in. So up before that point, you could log in with your Google username and Google password directly from an OCS or any other third-party app, and it would allow login and email operation. Well, as of May 2022, that didn't work anymore. That impacted not only Horner OCS customers, but just about every other industrial device that supports email generation from Gmail. But the good news is Google did create a new procedure of generating an app password, which allows devices like Horner OCS to support Gmail once again. So we're going to go through that with you next. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to go through this slide step by step, and then we're going to demonstrate it for you live. So what are the steps required to generate an app password? Well, the first thing you need to do if you haven't done so already is that you're going to need to create a Google account for the machine. Now, if the machine already had a Google account, which therefore generated a Google email, then that step has already been completed. But once it has been completed, next you need to log in to the Google account. And once that's happened, you need to select Google Apps, select Security, select two-step verification, and then follow that procedure to the end. Once that's done, you're going to go back to Google Apps, select Security once again, and this time select App Passwords. Under Mail, you'll find a list of devices that are available, and you're going to select the last one, which is Other. And then you have the ability to assign a custom name. That could be something like stamping machine or OCS 1234, whatever you want to call it. After you've assigned a name, now you have the ability to generate a password. And that particular password is going to be the one that you're going to plug in to the login credentials for the OCS when the OCS is logging into the SMTP server for Google. Now, there's two ways you can do that, of course. You can hard code the password, which is an option, or maybe better yet, if you've assigned a variable to the password, you can go into the OCS from the touchscreen somewhere, maybe in a protected screen, and basically type in that new password from there, and then if it ever changes again in the future, you don't have to fire up Cscape to rectify that. So that's the procedure I've described here on the slide. Let's go ahead and do that on the computer next. So now we're going to go through and we're going to generate an app password so that the OCS can log in to Gmail. So my first step was signing in to the Gmail account of the OCS-based machine. So in this case, it was hornerautomation.ocs@gmail.com. That is the Gmail account for the OCS-based machine that I'm going to generate an app password for. So I'm signed in. Next, I need to go to Google Apps, under Account. Technically, I was already there. Go under Security, and I have to have already completed two-step verification. If I haven't done so, I have to do that next and go through that process. But I'm not going to show that to you. I think at this stage we've all done enough two-step verification processes. That's not an issue. So that's complete. But next, I need to generate an app password. So how do I do that? Again, back to Security, and then I need to scroll down and find the app password section. I've got none created so far. So let's go there first. It's going to ask me to sign in with my password again, or to re-provide my password. I'll do that. Remember, this is the password for the OCS-based machine. Now, under Select App, I'm going to grab this pull-down list, and at the very bottom, I'm going to select Other with Custom Name, and I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this OCS based machine and hit generate. Now if this was some sort of other machine, like a molding machine or OCS 1234, whatever I wanted to call it, I could call it whatever, but I've named this OCS based machine, and now I'm going to generate the app password. It's now given me the app password, so now that's the password I can use whenever I need to log in, or whenever the OCS needs to log in to Gmail so it can send emails. Now we've gone through the procedure to generate an app password. Let's take a look at an example OCS email application in Cscape so you can get some ideas on some of the things you might want to integrate into your next application with OCS. Here's my Cscape demo application for this video. Again, the goal here is to give you all the information you need so that you can use Gmail if that's what you choose to do. And I'll show you some good techniques that you might be able to take advantage of some of these in your application. So let's get started in the program messaging email area of Cscape. So this is really where we configure all the email type information and data for the application. First thing we're going to have to do is check this checkbox, enable email configuration. Now, email is a fairly complicated feature, and I absolutely recommend that you take advantage of the status. And Cscape is asking for 2 16-bit words of status. So I would definitely recommend you take advantage of that. I've allocated a word array with a dimension of 2 to house that status information. So that was the first little bit of work there. And then these are the different areas that ultimately require configuration for email. The first one is all the details in terms of your email server. So that's the one we're going to go through with the most detail, because that's the one where all the details for logging into Gmail need to be housed. And then down here, we'll just spend a brief amount of time a little bit later talking about creating an email directory and outgoing messages, because those are things that we'll cover in more detail in other videos and have already been covered in some other videos as well. But let's dive into this email server configuration. Now there's 2 different approaches you can take when you are filling in the details for the server. One is that you can not check this checkbox and you can just hard code in everything. So things like the server name for the email server would be like, ultimately, you could just hard code this as smtp.gmail.com. The port number that you want to use for logging in is going to be 587, because that is the port number for TLS type security, and that's what's used in the OCS. So you could just hard code that as 587. And then username and password. Username is going to be the Gmail email for this particular machine. You could just hard code that in there. You know, in my example, it was hornerautomation.ocs@gmail.com. And then the password is that app password that we generated in the last step on the last demo. So all that could be hard coded, and there's nothing wrong with that, except that if anything changes in the future, you're going to have to get Cscape out to make the change. So what I prefer to do is to assign variables to all of these things. And to do that, I have to check this checkbox that says get settings from registers, or get settings from variables is what it's basically meaning there. So I've assigned actual variables to all these. So the email address of the machine is, in my example here, it's the actual Gmail address that I'm using for this machine. So I've assigned that to a byte type array. And in my particular example, I've made that with a length of 32 characters. And then I point at the first character, which is obviously with an index of 0. Now, if we're going to be accessing an SMTP server, in this case it's Gmail, if we're just going to be accessing it from a numeric IP address, then we can fill that numeric IP address in separately down here. But in our case, our address to access Gmail is smtp.gmail.com. So that is definitely going to require a DNS server to do that lookup for us. So we're going to have to assign a variable here for the DNS server that we want to use to do that work for us. So I almost always use 8.8.8.8 or 8.8.4.4. So I've assigned a variable here. It's a 32-bit regular 32-bit variable. And on the screen, I've got a place where I can type that in IP address format. And then this is the byte type array that's going to house our SMTP server name, which is going to be smtp.gmail.com. Ultimately, that'll be what this variable holds. And then my SMTP port, that variable is again a 16-bit numeric port number, and it's going to house 587 as my port number. And then down here, this is my authentication for logging into the actual Gmail server. So my username in the case of Gmail is going to be the actual email address for that particular Gmail account. And then the SMTP password is going to be the app password that we were granted, that we generated in the previous demo. Got it. So that's really what we need for logging into Gmail. To support this, I'm going to show you what I did on the screen. So let's go to our screen, and then I'm going to pick my little navigation finger here. So I just have a generic home screen with nothing on it except an email button. And this is where I'm providing the user the ability to type in the IP address, netmask, and gateway for this particular OCS. And gateway is important because potentially we're leaving the plant to send this email or what have you. So generally the gateway is important here. This is where I've having them plug in the DNS server address. So this is ultimately going to contain 8.8.8.8 or something similar. And then here is where they're going to type in from the keyboard smtp.gmail.com and then the app password that we were granted in the previous demo. And then this is where 587 is going to be plugged in. All this takes a fair amount of typing in. I've provided a couple of convenience features. I've provided a single button for loading defaults. So I've got some ladder logic that supports doing some string moves to move default information or default values into all these data fields with the press of a single button. That can be pretty useful. You might want to put that into your ladder logic just so that you have that single button that you can press on startup so you don't have to manually type everything in. In addition to this information here, one other convenience feature I want to mention, and that is I've also got a clear button next to every ASCII field so that if you're going to change it, you can start by just clearing it out as a starting point. It's not strictly necessary, but it can be very useful. Let's continue on to the email address setup screen. This is where we're typing in the machine email address for the local OCS. That was in my example. For my specific case, it was hornerautomation.ocs@gmail.com. So that's the local address for this OCS. And then I've got a couple of email addresses for people that I might want to send emails to from this OCS. I've created a maintenance category and a management category, and here's where I can plug in email addresses for each of those. And finally, I've got a test screen that allows me to configure an email that I will send as a test. And I've got a button that allows me to trigger that. Now this button to trigger an email, the way you do that is you turn on a bit to trigger an email, and then the OCS firmware, when it's done, will turn that bit off. So in this case, this trigger test email button is a toggle switch, not a momentary push button. And then that email status I talked about that we do want to take advantage of, I went to the trouble to break out all the data that's available in that status register from all the individual potential errors. I also decoded the different states that the email engine could be in when one of these errors occurred. And then if we ever get some sort of error code back from the SMTP server, it would be contained in this particular feedback area here. So that shows you kind of the supporting information I have on the screen. Now I'm not going to go into any details on the ladder logic I put in here. Basically, this is the ladder logic for copying the defaults, clearing out individual data fields, extracting data from the system registers for the screen, that sort of thing. And it's very well detailed and very well documented. You can download it and take a look at that yourselves. And then the last thing I want to show is just a very cursory look at creating email groups as well as emails to send out. So I'll go back to the email area here and I'll show you what the email directory is all about. Again, this is just a cursory look at this feature. You can set up a whole series of groups that you may want to send emails to, and within those groups you can assign one or multiple email addresses. So in my case, here's that maintenance group I created, the management group I created, the test group I created. And in this example, I've just got one email address going to each of them, and I've made these variables instead of hard coded. Now, if they were hard coded, you could hard code those addresses here, but I chose not to do that. So this is the email directory. And then lastly, a cursory look at the outgoing messages and how you can create those. For each outgoing message, you need to create a trigger bit, which is a Boolean variable that you're going to turn on in your application. That's going to trigger that email. And then the OCS firmware will turn that bit off again when it's done. And then when you configure the email that goes out, you can put a subject and a body of the email. I've just put simple text in the body, but you can also embed live data fields. You can also do file attachments. Very versatile in terms of the emails that you can create. So that's just a cursory look at those particular elements of the email setup. So hopefully this gives you what you need to know in order to log into Gmail now that they've made their changes to their security requirements back in May of 2022. Let's take a look at this at runtime. There's our LAN and email setup screen with everything filled in. IP address, netmask, gateway, etc. You can see our SMTP server for Gmail, as well as that app password that we generated earlier. There's the DNS address so that the OCS can communicate with smtp.gmail.com, because that's not strictly a numeric IP address. Our SMTP port number of 587 because we're using TLS security. You can see we've got clear buttons and load default buttons for convenience when we're entering in the data. We can also see that we've got the ability to fill in the email address for the local machine. And then for some recipients, I've just put my work email in for all of those. And then we've got a test screen, which allows us to send a test email and to push a button to generate that test email. Let's do that now. And remember, we want to turn that bit on and let the firmware itself turn it off. And then we can also look at email status at any time we like. The OCS is in the process of generating the email. It's being sent off to the SMTP server. And then the process can take maybe up to a minute or so, depending on how quickly everything happens. But when it's done, that trigger bit will turn off. And then I'll check my phone for the received email. You can see the button has turned off, which should indicate we've got the email. And there it is. It's come in as we wanted. So that's a look at what can happen in real time. That does it for today's content. I do want to remind you we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, whether we're fully live or whether we pre-record our video and then stream it live while we answer your questions. Also, next week we've got another good topic for you. We're going to show you how you can convert your register-based logic programs that you may have created over the years with Advanced Ladder and Cscape, and how you can convert those to the very latest variable-based logic programs that'll allow you to take advantage of some exciting new features like user-defined function blocks, structures, and more. So it's really a fairly straightforward, easy process. But as always, we want to make sure you have all the information before you take on a task like converting your register-based logic programs over to variable-based. I'd like to remind you, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel. It doesn't cost anything. And if you select notifications when you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we record a new video. Okay, so until we meet next week, let's all get out there and do some good.